Welcome. My name is E.J. McAdams, and I'm a poet, naturalist, and nonprofit leader who works for BirdLife International, a partnership of 122 independent national civil society organizations working to protect nature and people. I'm also a poet. My first book of poems came out from Blaze Box Books last year. Before we start, I wanted to do a short land acknowledgement that I've modified from the University of New Orleans Center for Student Connection and Belonging. We want to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands, and that the lands on which we sit are the original homelands of indigenous peoples of what was called Bulbancha, or a place of many tongues before it was known as New Orleans. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and for non-indigenous citizens to improve our understanding of local indigenous peoples and cultures. We acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all indigenous peoples who call this land home. Please, as poets, take a moment to reflect on what might happen if we acknowledge the past harms and mistakes and consider how we can each, in our own way, try to move forward in the spirit of reconciliation and right relationships in collaboration with indigenous peoples. Thank you everyone for attending our panel on environmental and ecological justice, which explores how poetry supports making our communities more equally resilient through the forces of economics and language, and contributes to a more inclusive way of speaking about climate change, which we experience at local and global scales. However, most of the action begins at the local level, and the panel includes a local New Orleans poet and poets from other localities. It is important to note that 3 of our panelists were not able to come to New Orleans at the last minute because of personal reasons. Unfortunately, we won't benefit from the presence of Tanya Foster, Tommy Perry, or Marcella Durand, but Marcella sent her talk, which I will read. We send them care from here today. I don't want to presume that everyone in the room here knows about environmental and ecological justice. There are many resources online, but one I would encourage everyone to pull up this weekend is the Principles of Environmental Justice that came out in 1991 to ground yourselves as poets in this essential statement. Like you, I am not an expert by any means, but have been on a learning journey since the 90s. I thought it might be beneficial to share 2 stories from this journey. The first one I learned about environmental racism, and the next one I understood the importance of environmental justice to any broader movement. The late Cecil Corbin Mark, the deputy director of WEAC for Environmental Justice in Harlem, was the one who schooled me in environmental racism. He was making a presentation to mostly white environmental nonprofits and community leaders. He presented a map which showed that most of the diesel bus depots in Manhattan were located in neighborhoods of color. Those decisions were leading to high asthma rates in the children in the community. He argued that environmental racism could be intentional or unintentional, but that ultimately it didn't matter. The effect was the same. Communities of color were being exploited and harmed despite the personal attitudes of many people in the room that day. He asked us how we were going to respond to environmental racism, and my response was to educate myself and my organization about it, which was a start. It took another New York City leader to demonstrate what environmental justice looks like and what my role as a leader of a white-led organization might be. I was in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, where the city had a redevelopment plan for the waterfront. I'd come to the neighborhood to advocate for one of the piers to be a nature preserve. There was nothing wrong with wanting that, but it was missing context, which is so key in issues of environmental racism. The executive director of Uprose, Elizabeth Yampierre, gave me that context and did not pull any punches. She told me in no uncertain terms that the nature preserve would be used to make white people feel more comfortable, ultimately gentrifying the community, and so her community would need to secure its benefits first. When this happened in this order, the nature preserve would not only benefit the birds, but also the community. The logic was clear, and the lesson for me was that environmental justice must come first if we want to have a healthy ecosystem. Practically, that means environmental leaders, particularly of white-led organizations, must work in the support of environmental justice, even if they're coming from other corners of the environmental movement. What that has meant for my understanding of poetry is that I have a great suspicion of the so-called nature poem, which, despite the poet's personal attitude, might be unintentionally perpetuating gentrification, at least of the imagination, if not more concrete and material than that. Poems that foreground their relationship to power, land, economy, and history actually hit on the process of nature better, because we are nature, acting on it and being acted on. I'm looking forward to the panel today because everyone is wrestling with aspects of these concerns in their presentations. So get ready now to listen as this small but mighty panel of poets share their talks. I will introduce the panelists now, and then we can run through the panel without interruption. We'll open with the local perspective, human and non-human embodiment, symbiosis and solidarity. A poetic practitioner and editor from the Great Lakes, currently living on the Gulf Coast, Gabrielle Octavia Rucker's debut poetry collection is Dereliction from the Song Cave. She will discuss how Suzanne Cesaire's 1945 essay, The Great Camouflage, guides her thinking about eco-solidarity across climate, labor, and race. Then we're going to look at the challenges of definitions from local to global scales. New York City-based James Sherry is the author of 14 books of poetry, most recently Selfie, Poetry, Social Change, and Ecological Connection from Palgrave Macmillan. He will talk about ecology from the perspective of the language we use in poetry about the environment to make it more active, more effective, and more aligned with our intentions. Words like eco-poetry are based on assumptions that cannot persist in an environmentally friendly world. And then I'll read from Marcella Durand. Marcella also lives in New York City and is the author of several books of poetry, including To Husband is to Tender, The Prospect, and forthcoming in 25, A Winter Triangle. She notes that words like natural, resiliency, and sustainable are used to cloak and cover everything from meat products to construction projects. Even green space now might mean green paint splashed over a square of asphalt. Totally unmoored from the realities of climate collapse around us, these greenwashing words mean exactly the opposite of what they say. It is here that poets may rescue language, replacing words to new possibilities of definition within the poetic space. Finally, we'll open it up to you, the audience, to play the role of circulatory system, which was to be a theme for Dr. Tanya Foster's talk. The title of this panel also talks about ecological justice, which, as much as I love ecology and the potential for trans-species solidarity, I was a bit suspicious of. I don't think there is anything in ecological justice that was not already in environmental justice if you really read the principles. I wondered if it might be a gentrifying attempt by white academics, but then I heard the tremendous, recently passed poet Tyrone Williams, in preparation for this panel, elucidate it in his own words through his poet lens. He talked about the importance of relationship, reciprocity, and in-betweenness, and how climate change is not a New Orleans problem, which I take to mean it is not the subject or object, but the syntax that ties them together that should be the focus of our justice work. With that, I turn it over to the panel. You got that.
Hi. Let's see how cozy I can get. Some of you have one of these. If you don't have one of them, you can always share with a neighbor. That's okay. They were passed out only if you were printed. I'm going to start really quickly. There's an insert. As EJ just said, Tyrone Williams, who was originally meant to be a part of this panel, passed last month on March 11th. And we have a little bookmark with one of Tyrone's poems that I'd like to read. It's called Set Net. A sea, the Homo sapiens among us soon evaporate, condense above as clouds, umbrella of meta, the humans left behind in cultures, crow Neanderthals in vexed caves of petri disbelief. Seas congeal, suspend bridges, What gets through stopped up ears. A hand overboard slows to a glove. A leg retracts. A production lists for pyramid. The trade winds stage direction. Exunt toes the wake. My talk is more experiential than it really is. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a environmentalist. I'm not an ecologist. I'm really truly a poet. And I'll be approaching this through being a poet and having once been a young person. Most of my work is about being a young person. I also don't have this is going to be a part of my presentation, so I'll be telling you to flip to pages to look at things because I don't have a PowerPoint. So on the front is Suzanne Cissière. Suzanne Cissière was born on August 11th in 1915 in Poitiers, Martinique. And she was born to her mother named Flore, who was a school teacher, and her father, Benoit, and he was a sugar factory worker. And there's a lot of discussion about factories coming up. So Suzanne Cissière was the author and editor of a journal called Tropiques, which was published in Martinique. And this book, The Great Camouflage, Writings of Descent, 1941 to 1945, edited by Daniel Maxman and translated by Keith L. Walker, has a number of her essays, as well as some poetic works by some of her colleagues, as well as her husband. I'm actually much more familiar with Suzanne's work than her husband's, who you probably already know as Aimé Cissière. So the essay that I'm talking about, or will be referencing throughout this talk, is called The Great Camouflage, and it opens with a horse being struck by a bolt of lightning on a mountain. And there's this quote after this horse is struck, and the horse's master, alarmed by the ferocity of the storm, contemplates the land he believes sound and expansive. He does not yet know he is participating in the island's lack of equilibrium. And I'm really currently interested in how all of us, poets included, are involved in the lack of equilibrium across the natural world. And so that's kind of my mini thesis. And this essay peels back like facades of colonialism, nationality, slavery, race, and class, and industrialization, as well as some other things like tourism that I really won't be getting into that much. So I remember reading this essay for the first time, published. I found a PDF of Tropiques. I was at work. I used to work at a redacted literary location in New York City that I'm sure if I said it, all of you would know. But I worked in a windowless lobby of this kind of suite of the building, and I was set up in a way that the rest of, if this were my desk where I sat, the front door would be where the audience is, and the entire office was behind me. So anytime someone walked up behind me, I could be surveilled. And it was really difficult for me to just do things I wanted to do. Like, I always got my work done, but it was difficult to write, to read. And so I was always reading or writing in a state of, I was being a fugitive at work, as most of us are. And I had found this PDF on my work time. I was stealing time. I was reading it, and I was blown away. I was completely just breathless afterwards. And I went on my lunch break, and this office is in downtown Manhattan in Wall Street. And so let's read what I wrote. The office suite stood lofted some 13 stories, give or take, in a building amongst a sea of buildings on what was once a forested island turned present-day global metropolis. It was no secret to me at the time, as I wandered the maze of cobblestone streets in search of an affordable lunch, that this office, where I spent the majority of my free time working for measly wages, stood in the middle of what was once the New York municipal slave market. So, if you go to, well, there's a picture of Martinique, if you're unfamiliar with that country, on page 2. And right next to it is a photo it's probably easier to see not in blue light, or these stage lights, but it's a corner of Water Street and Wall Street, and there's a plaque dedicated to the Wall Street Municipal Slave Market. And this slave market, the placard was put up in 2015, and this was the main port of where slaves were brought into New York City. And obviously this also used to be indigenous land, so it was stolen, turned into a slave market, then turned into the global corporation of the whole world, really. And so that's where this is taking place. Like, this is where I am right after reading this essay. These are where these thoughts are happening. Let's see. Okay, so a placard located at the intersections of Wall Street and Water Street, which you're looking at, was dedicated to this history in 2015, but I rarely saw anyone pause to read it as I passed by. And a few blocks away, and if you turn the page, also in Wall Street, in the middle of all these major financial corporations and seedy governmental psyops and co-ops, was also the Museum of the National Museum of the Native American. And I always found it very strange that both of these entities were located in Wall Street. And strange, not so much that it doesn't make sense that they're there, but strange to feel through and strange to negotiate my reality with every day as I go to work. Every day as a Black person going to work in an old slave market, which is still actually a current slave market, if you will. And so I'm saying this really so that we can think about our awareness or lack of awareness and lack of curiosity toward our current environments or lack thereof. So before this was a slave market, before this was a financial epicenter, it was a forest. And so a lot of what my time spent after reading this essay as I was going on my lunch breaks was trying to meditate back to the forest that I was living in the future of, this perverted forest that now is this financial epicenter. And so some of these are questions. Again, this is just a experiential talk. What do we gain by suspending belief and suspending the present moment to time travel back to the forest, back to the slave market, back to the trade route? What remnants of our current ecology are still present? What have we lost? I think it's really easy when we talk about ecology, or when I hear us talking about ecology or environmentalism, we talk about what's currently happening, the current infrastructure. And not that that doesn't matter, but I'm really interested in the psychic lineage of infrastructures that we've eradicated. So language isn't the only tether to memory, and it's not, language isn't inherently rooted in justice. Sometimes how we construct our realities is what needs to be rooted in justice. So to say all that, it's never been really difficult for me to see beyond the veil of modernity, even as I walk through the neighborhood that I live in, here in New Orleans, below sea level. I'm often thinking about swamplands. I'm thinking about what this place looked like, even this cafe that we're in. Right now we're very much located in this cafe. Experientially, we can only see this, but this was a swamp. And if you could suspend yourself for a moment and suspend the audiences, suspend the panel and the tables and the chairs and the lights, can you get back to the swamp? Can you, in your imagination, do that? I personally can see quite clearly the wellspring of life unfurling, accordion-like through time. It's no trouble for me to imagine on any given day, at any given hour, the inevitable rubble of my house and the dormant forest waiting to overtake it. Next, I'm going to read a quote from the book that I think is in here. Yeah, if you go to your back cover, I'm going to read this quote. You can also just listen. So this is from The Great Camouflage. A peasant who himself was not swooped up in the hoopla surrounding the mechanical adventure leaned against the great mapo tree of spirits that shades the entire side of the mountain and felt rising within him, through his toes dug firmly into the mud, the deep a deep vegetal thrust. And then there's a picture right across from that in your little pamphlet of a mapo tree and a oil rig. And that's just, I'm not talking about oil rigs, but we are in Louisiana and there are many oil rigs. There is potentially oil beneath you, or we will be oil in a few thousand million years, whatever. Anyway, sorry, I have a lot more time than I thought I did, so I'm gonna meander a bit. The next part of this talk is now kind of how do I find myself rooted in this, or how was I co-opted into participating in dismantling the equilibrium of the natural world, which we've all been co-opted into. So as a child, I grew up in Michigan. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. My father owned a small plastics plant. If you want to go back to page 5, he owned a small plastics plant in Tecumseh, Michigan. And this is just a picture of the city of Tecumseh, which has nothing really in it. They used to have a cute little chocolate factory, but that got closed down. So my father owns this small plastics plant, and this plastics plant makes predominantly Ford, like parts for Ford cars. On the next page, page 6, this is something that I made a lot because I worked in my dad's factory as a child, which I'll get more into. But this is a Ford light socket, the light bulbs that go with it, and then this kind of spaceship looking thing at the top is what goes on top of it, and these are license plate lights. So if you see a Ford car of a certain year, a certain time, and you look on the back of it, there's a likelihood that I made that part because my dad's plant was the only plant that made that particular part. And my dad would hire my sister and I to make these parts during the summer. And now it's gonna get a little into race. I have no answers for anything that I'm saying. It's just storytelling, which is that my father is a black man. He owned a small plastics plant in a predominantly white town, rural white town. Most of his workers were white, and he employed his black children to work there, and he paid us more than he paid them. And that was a huge lesson of what we were being told while we worked there. And also while we worked there, my father told us that he was having us work there so that we would never have to work in a plant again. I don't know if I agree with that or not. I think it's kind of sick, but not sick as in twisted, sick as in like rad. Maybe you can find it sick or twisted either, but that is where I'm coming from. Like this is one of my formative childhood experiences, being a child in a plant, smelling burning plastic, having no sort of like mask or anything, working alongside these working class individuals who my father had obviously some sort of power struggle internally with because of slavery. We're back at the slave market. You know, where does the slave market re-bloom itself? I mean, it's never really dormant, it's always there. And so this is happening in a factory setting. And I guess I'm saying this to say that environmental injustice lives in our bones and it lives in our bodies, it lives in our memories. We pass that trauma down through our children, to our schoolmates, to our communities. I want to be clear that slavery and genocide, all genocides, are environmental injustices. Removing a group of people from their homeland and having them come do labor is an environmental injustice. Eradicating a group of people from their ancestral land, their like indigenous land, is an environmental injustice. And so environmental injustice doesn't just look infrastructural, it's body, you know, it's somatic. So we pass this down and we suffer oftentimes in silence. What I understood was that my father was suffering in silence in a way. And you don't have to, you know, empathize with him, but that's what was happening. Often when I talk to my father and I ask him about his work and labor experience, he says, I was worked like a slave as a child. I don't think a black person who was born in the 1940s is using that word hyperbolically, you know? So what is the significance of my father employing my sister and I, the black children of a black factory owner, in his plant? I don't know, you know? You can think about that. What is the significance of co-opting your children in the schemata, however unconscious or not, of revenge and labor dynamic, of a revenge of labor dynamics, because that's what I thought was happening. There's this revenge of labor dynamics happening in this factory. And what I think no one could see, and what I didn't know, what my father didn't consider, was that, you know, we're being exposed to toxicity. Not only like the toxicity of this like deep history, but the literal toxicity of like burning plastic. I cannot describe to you what a plastic plant smells like. It's crazy. And I played in there all the time. But I also had this realization at some point that by working in the factory, my father taught me subconsciously how to detect where the factory repopulates itself in our own lives. He was teaching me how to detect where the factory existed in my life and how any job, any life can and often will take the form of the factory. I'm gonna read another quote. This one is not in your little pamphlet, so you'll just have to listen. This is also from The Great Camouflage. It was necessary first and at all cost, be it even the price of the black slave trade's infamy, to recreate an American society richer, more powerful, better organized than the European society left behind, yet still desired. It was necessary to take this revenge upon the nostalgic hell that was vomiting its adventurer demons, its galley slaves, its penitents, its utopians upon the shores of the New World and its islands. For 3 centuries, colonial adventurism has continued. The wars of independence are only an episode, and the American people, whose behavior vis-a-vis Europe has remained often childish and romantic, are still not freed from the grip of the old continent. Of course, it is the blacks of the Americas who suffer the most in a daily humiliation from the degradations, the injustices, and the pettiness of colonial society. So there's a sentence I just read in there, or really 2 words, childish and romantic, that the American people whose behavior mirroring Europe is childish and romantic. Romantic in the way that I think Wall Street is romantic. It's a utopian idea of what like capitalism can be and what it's striving towards, and childish insofar as the inability to share, you know, like the inability for wealth to trickle down, or for wealth to also just be eradicated and therefore be like this more parallel type of, I don't know, relationship to money and wealth. So lastly, this is hopefully the bow I can tie on this talk, which is I'm often contemplating how the literary arts mirrors the factory. How, and I hope this isn't, I'm not trying to be, this isn't personal, but how spaces like this can mirror a factory. You know, this is labor, this is work. How award ceremonies, literary award ceremonies, how is that a reanimation of the factory? How come support is dependent upon accolades? You know, why is my success dependent, and not mine personally, but all of our success dependent upon the value that we can inspire in the literary art community? I'm often really troubled by this thought, and I have really a difficult time understanding or reconciling my own value internally and outwardly within the literary arts. And I don't have any answers about that. This talk is not about answers, but I do have a very helpful quote that I will end with, and this is on page 7. And this is an excerpt from C.A. Conrad's book, Eco-Deviance. It's called Somatic Poetry Rituals, and I'll read it aloud for us. Growing up in a rural factory town, I watched my creative family extend the grind of their monotonous jobs outside the factory walls and into their lives until they were no longer capable of assessing their artistic abilities. The factory essentially divorced them from their sense of their essential selves. This wouldn't happen to me, I thought, and I moved to a large city to foster my skills as an artist and to surround myself with like-minded people. Oops, sorry, I misread that like crazy. Like-minded people. For many years, this was feeling right. that I was doing exactly what I came to do, not working in the factory back home. But in 2005, when visiting my family for a reunion, I listened again to their stories about the factory, and as always, these stories saddened me. On the train ride home, I had an epiphany that I had been treating my poetry like a factory, an assembly line, and doing so in many different ways, from how I constructed the poems, to my tabbed and sequence folders for submissions to magazines, etc. This was a crisis, and I stopped writing for nearly a month, needing to figure out how to climb out of these factory-like structures or to quit writing altogether. But I wanted to thrive in the crisis rather than end the trajectory of self-discovery the poems had set me on over the years. One morning I made a list of the worst possible problems with the factory, and at the top of that list was lack of being present. The more I thought about this, the more I realized this was what the factory robbed my family of the most, and the thing that frightened me the most, this not being aware of place in the present. Being aware of place in the present. We are in a swamp. That morning, I started what I now call somatics, ritualized structures where being anything but present was next to impossible. These rituals create what I refer to as an extreme present, where the many facts of what is around me, wherever I am, can come together through a sharper lens. It has been inspiring that somatics reveal the creative vulnerability for everything around me. And I won't read the last because I don't have CA's book, but my last question that you can take home is, where is the factory reproducing itself in your life, in your creative projects, and in your community, in your environment? They are intrinsically intertwined. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabrielle. That was kind of an amazing story. I didn't know about your history in plastics. Because we have a little more time today with this incredible flood of death and disease, I wanted to point out that this idea of ecological justice was one that Tyrone came up with. I started talking about this as environmental justice, and he pointed out that it's not about the things that are in our lives, but about our inability to explore and understand the things that connect us, which is, in fact, a social ecology. So this is based on Tyrone's idea, and I think it's what I would like us all to come away with, is this sense of ecological justice. Because the biggest problem for the environmental movement, I think, is the conflict between the fact that every individual is protecting their bodies. You don't want to walk out in front of traffic. You don't want to fall down into a well. We spend a huge amount of time protecting, feeding, nourishing, sleeping our bodies so that they can continue. But at the same time that we're doing all this stuff as individuals, we are also living together, and the conflicts arise almost immediately. And this becomes even more difficult when we add the third term, which is our surroundings. And so the individual has a great deal of difficulty reconciling their personal needs with the needs of their society and the needs of their surroundings. So these are the things that to me drive the difficulties of any kind of justice around environment, and force us into understanding more and more about the things that connect us. So my talk, which I wrote before Tonya got sick, Tyrone passed, Marcella's father went into hospice and she had to fly out to be with him, was an 8-minute talk on ecological justice, the mot juste, and connected poetry. So this is my original thought. New Orleans has been through so many storms and floods that it's incumbent on any poetry concerned with environment to help people avoid suffering from climate change, because they are poor or because of other biases. We must explore how we make our communities more equally resilient to the changes that are already in progress. We must understand the forces that are driving inequality. We can identify how to strengthen our communities more equally and present how poetry can contribute to a more inclusive way of speaking about the problem. What are the climate solutions for a more just future? How are those solutions that include climate justice different from those that keep the current class structure in place? These are important questions, but let me be frank. Poetry isn't going to stop climate change, but it can change language and thereby support changing how we think about ourselves and our daily use of words and interactions. Some words will pressure us to continue to think as we have been thinking and act as we have been acting. Some words will introduce relationships, metaphoric relations, that lead us to a more sympathetic rapport with our surroundings. I, for example, have not been a fan of the abbreviation eco, as in eco-poetry. For one, it means that concepts are jammed together or connected with hyphens that are not inherent in what we mean by ecological poetry, which is the poetry of connection to our surroundings, rather than a description of things, which is called pastoral. These corporate constructions, like eco-poetry, reflect a weakness of imagination and a laziness of speaking fostered by commercial interests that seek our passive consumption of language and of stuff. If we are to successfully throw off the shackles of corporate controls over the necessities of life and of our thought, then we must not use their tactics in creating minor monstrosities like eco-poetry. Second, eco's root in the term oikos, meaning house or dwelling, limits our understanding of the earth to a home, when earth is so much more to humans, operating at many scales, including womb, repository of resources that we need to survive, source of conflict in that the interests of all species cannot really coincide in the complexity of the multiple lives and multiple species with multiple needs. Melissa Tuckey's introduction to her immense and useful anthology, Ghost Fishing, aims from two directions at the term eco, and in the same sentence. Quote, "I've come to recognize that no experience of nature is monolithic, that our relations to the natural world are grounded in cultural experience. This wonderful sentence points to solutions to climate change that inherently improve the likelihood of a more just system emerging from climate change, rather than soothing us to inaction, when now our actions to correct the trajectory of our climates have never been more urgently required. First, our experience of our surroundings cannot be monolithic, because we relate to our surroundings in so many ways through various identities, such as creator of the processes we need to survive, the user of resources, the regulator of behavior through human and natural law, family, poetry, looking carefully at our own behavior. We see our surroundings differently when we're in a community garden than when we're in line at a polling place or at the DMV. This kind of diversity of identity extends to distributed energy sources and productivity in ways that support zero emissions. If our homes and small communities have control of their own solar panels, how much more easily do we identify with clean energy? Second, if, as Tuckey says, our relations to the natural world are grounded in cultural experience, then individuals are decentered and part of a larger taxonomy of community, of species, and of life forms in general. The simple framework of the planet as a house is clearly not the cultural and group experience of the community that builds culture, because nature and culture merge in important ways. To me, this framework is more productive of the kinds of change that communities need to become more legally and relationally resilient. The framework of nature and culture together makes more sense than treating the problems of each individual as the goal of building a more just society with environmental solutions. Third, I hope it's becoming obvious to you that one can be both right and wrong at the same time. I note that Tucky, with the term eco-justice, slips into corporate speech even in the title of her anthology. Attending to only individual concerns, even attending to individual and group concerns together, doesn't make sense environmentally because ecology, the term the abbreviation eco comes from, is about relationships between things, not the things or homes themselves. The connections that build an ecological network are the important underdeveloped part of both culture and individual identity that much poetry associated with climate change has not modeled effectively. These connections between things are both risky in theories like intersectionality and nurturing in planetary cycles like the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle. When poetry links individuals, groups, and our surroundings, while revealing those relationships as the physical embodiments of human ecology, poetry can be an inherent part of environmental justice. Climate change is driven at multiple levels. Capitalism needs to expand. Individuals need to fulfill their drives. Communities want to fulfill their perceived destinies. Yet our surrounding ecosystems are not infinitely flexible, creating inherent conflict of interest, a complex meaning that poetry is quite suited to discover, to tell about, and to present. Finally, solutions cannot be uniform. The needs and poems of tropical peoples are different than those of higher latitudes, as the weather and kinds of behavior weather supports are different in different places. High altitudes make people think differently than seaside folks, tell stories with different textures, and use different metrics in speech and in writing. Justice is a connective process, which our dear friend Tyrone Williams wanted to call ecological justice when he was part of this panel in his final days. Since ecology, again, is about the relationships between elements of an ecosystem, intersections of components and forces, and the sources of how things work together. Understanding justice is climate change as a relational activity makes it easier to equalize conditions through connection. Relational justice can be applied with the facts of every case. The social origin of a person, however, must now extend to an origin also based on location and on ecological connectivity. I think we'll, do you have questions? Yeah, I think people have questions. So let's see what that, Roxy?
Thanks, Chase. That was beautiful, and I just wanted to acknowledge Tyrone and Marcella as well. In an anthology that I published, they were both side by side, talking kind of against romantic conceptions of descriptive eco-poetics and then those inheritances. And when you were doing the same thing in a way, but talking about how it's very different being in a community garden than in a DMV line, I thought of the kind of binarized poetry of Wordsworth and Blake, you know, wandering lonely as a cloud versus London. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you can think of in the honor, in the name or whatever of Tyrone, that we can begin to name the human ecological connection. I mean, really literally mean like, what's the name? Because when, you know, ecological justice still throws me into the garden a bit. Human ecology sounds a little like, you know, human resources. So I just throw that out there to ask if Tyrone, did you know what his talk was? Did he say anything about that? The naming of something other than eco?
He didn't name it, and it was his idea to title the talk Ecological Justice.
Yeah.
So that was his thought, was to, again, not to be talking about things, but about the connections.
Yeah.
And I think so much injustice has to do with the way we're connected to each other, or connected in only narrow ways, as Gabrielle was talking about, working like a slave. It's something that we all think about, but do we make the connection back to what its real source is? So these are difficult questions, and I caution us to try to avoid finding single solutions to problems that are diverse in every instance.
Thank you.
I have a question. I just read a book called New Negro Aesthetic by Alan Locke, who's a part of the Black intelligentsia up in Harlem. And so he's writing like in the early 1900s. And I read where he said that he thought with art that it has to be like for art's sake. And that if you do it for something other than just for the sake of the art, that he questions the artistic value of it. If Alan Locke was here, right now, what would you say to him?
I don't like to channel Ghost on the spot, but I think that, I mean, I don't know if I'd say anything to him other than just that's very idealistic in the sense that like we have to eat, and that also the infrastructure of many not just literary arts but visual arts is set up so that you cannot actually do it for art's sake. You know, there's tons of grants and tons of residencies that you have to be nominated to apply to. You don't actually just get to go to them because you love to make art. You don't get to win awards simply because you love to make art. You don't show at biennials and whatever because you love to, unfortunately. So it's more of a systemic issue. I don't like thinking that that is like the individual artist's or writer's problem. I think that I used to tell people that like if you're stupid if you come to poetry thinking you're gonna make money. Like you know, I was once in a workshop where people were very much under the impression that getting published would bring you money, and that's not the truth. And that's not the truth because of how it's like systemically set up, and that you only will make money if you get to a certain level, if people can like see a certain amount of value within you. And so that's not really an issue that was bred by artists, but by corporations and by institutions co-opting the talents of artists. Does that feel like an answer or like a direction?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I don't agree with Alan Locke. And in fact, I think when you put it in a historical context, you talk about black people coming up from slavery, 35 years after slaves were freed. He's saying that you got to do art for art's sake. I don't even, unless you're just oblivious.
I mean, slaves were doing art for art's sake. You know, like art wasn't not being made during slavery.
Yeah, but I don't even know. The question is that if there's some people who want to do art for art's sake, that's your own choice. But for the people who say, yes, I live in this world, and there's a reality that, you know, I have a mother who's just a slave, but I can't like write about that. I use my work to somehow, you know, tell that story or make some point that I want to make. I disagree with Alan Locke.
Alan Locke, show yourself. Yeah.
Maybe to add a tiny bit of context, or nuance rather, a statement like Alan Locke's doesn't happen without a historical context also. So this is not to in any way give any less value to a current understanding of the circumstances, socially, economic. But for someone in that position, that's also a statement of resistance against another kind of definition that says you have to write about it. It's like being told, you know, have a black subject to your novel or whatever. Like being told you have to address X or Y, and Alan is saying, I need a kind of freedom. So there is a historical context even for his statement, which doesn't mean that when you take it out of context, it can be used to undermine another understanding of social. Maybe.
I'm interested, but when you read the book and you look at and you take that statement in context with everything else that was said, then you know that he meant that.
All right,
Oh,
one more?
oh, it's not a question. I just want to say that as we learned yesterday, I got an alert from the Ocean Conservancy. Today's the anniversary of the beginning of the BP oil disaster. So I just wanted to, especially because you brought up oil, and I was just thinking about that, and I just wanted to acknowledge that as part of this place and history. Thanks.
So we have to break down this setting, and next we're going to have a reading by Roof Authors in this place, same place, but we need to set up a slightly different mic system. So if you'll give us a few minutes, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back.